All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another Proseminar Monday speaker series. Most of you are online. I have a few here in person, so welcome. For those of you that are online, I'll ask you once again, please make sure you're muted. However, our speakers are in person again this week, so if you cannot see us or hear us, please do speak up because we cannot see you once we share our screen. So please don't be shy if you can't see anything. We need to know, okay? So following that, I just want to say we're welcoming Professor Roth back. We just heard from her a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to introduce her again, even though she's well known, and also her co-speakers. So now she's going to talk about other work she's doing. So Professor Roth is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Nevada, specializing in the study of prehistoric cultures in the southwestern US. Her main areas of interest include the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, the social changes, household organization, gender roles that result as groups become more sedentary and agriculturally dependent, and community development in the Mimbres region of southwestern New Mexico. She's directed excavations at several pit house period sites there at the Elk Ridge site, which we heard about a few weeks ago. But now she and some of our graduate students, including Kara Jones, who's here with us today, and Melina Luu, who unfortunately is not here with us, are going to come and talk about other work they're doing at the Stump Springs site in Pahrump Valley. In their talk titled Mojave Desert Landscapes, Insights from Current Research at the Stump Springs site in the Pahrump Valley. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and then I'm going to share the screen. What to share. There we go. Yes. How does that look? Does everybody see those slides? I think we're a small enough group. We can be informal here. Can you see us okay?
Yes, that's coming across on WebEx.
Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're dividing this up today, and I'm gonna talk generally about our research to kind of contextualize why we're at Stump Springs, why in the world were we out in the middle of the Pahrump Valley walking around, and then Kara is gonna discuss our actual work at Stump Springs. So for those of you, I mean, we live in the Mojave Desert, but for those of you who haven't gone outside of Vegas, the Mojave Desert is the driest desert in North America, and it encompasses Nevada, a little teeny bit of Utah, Arizona, and a lot in California. And it's very, very dry. There are several rivers that go through it, and the one that we are concerned about in our research is the Mojave River. But really, the lack of any kind of regular water supply is an issue. The good news is that prior to the construction of Las Vegas, but this whole region is covered with springs. If you've ever been to the Springs Preserve, you've seen that, but the whole region had a series of springs, and obviously that completely influenced what these folks were doing in this desert environment. Vegetation is sparse. Joshua tree is the most famous. There is some pinyon in the uplands, but again, they had to really target specific resources in moving around this region. In terms of game availability, bighorn was a major focus of their adaptations, and of course the mighty desert tortoise. And I just heard today Mojave Max has not yet come out of the burrow. So
have to ask about that.
The latest it's ever been. So I'm going to talk first about kind of how we got interested in Mojave Desert landscapes in pre-contact times. And I started work actually with Claude Warren, who was a professor here in the department. And we worked in an area called Zizix. You might have seen it as you're driving to LA off to the left. Zizix is now a research center that is run by UC
Cal State
Fullerton. Cal State Fullerton. But anyway, what this area used to be, so this is right on the way, if you go through Baker, you are literally sitting in the middle of what used to be a Pleistocene lake, the Pleistocene Lake Mojave. Through time, about probably 8,000 years ago, the lake desiccated and became two playas, which regularly fill with water, but it's non-potable water. And so we have Soda Playa in the south and Silver Lake in the north. And most of my research in this area has been at this end of Soda Playa, around this research center. And this whole area you'll hear referred to as the Mojave Sink. Look also at Afton Canyon, because I'll be talking about that in a few minutes as well. Most of the sites that we've been dealing with there date to the what's called the late prehistoric period, about AD 1200 to contact, characterized by these small arrow points, two different styles, use of ceramics, both brownwares, local brownwares, and Lower Colorado River buffwares. And what you're seeing in these groups is a real variability in land use tied to what's going on with the climate. And so that's what we got really interested in. And what we did was we went out and looked at Tiffany Arend, who's actually in that picture right there. Tiffany did her master's thesis doing a survey in this area. And what she found was that the majority of these late prehistoric sites were found in dunes along the western shore of Soda Playa. And what it looks like is that these were campsites where they camped in these dunes and near springs, not surprisingly. And then they also had these very specialized processing sites. And our work there has really shown that these were gender-specific task groups. And so plays into my interest in gender in the past. So this is, we first did work at Soda Springs Rock Shelter. That was when Claude had just retired, so Claude was part of this project. Soda Springs Rock Shelter is right there along the shore of the Soda Playa, originally excavated in the 1980s by Cal State Fullerton archaeologist named Joseph Mandival. A woman named Dee Schroff did her master's thesis on it, argued that it was a specialized hunting camp. They did a little bit of work in the shelter and a little bit right on the edge of the shelter. What we wanted to determine that the site had been excavated but never written up, except for Schroff mentioning that it was a specialized hunting camp. In part, we found out later that the two graduate students who were running the project at the time were killed in a plane crash right after this. So I went down to Cal State Fullerton, looked at the assemblage, and then we conducted excavation in midden deposits outside the rock shelter. We found evidence of use back to the Middle Archaic, so we did find Middle Archaic projectile points. But what was interesting is that we saw no change in use of this site through time, except in terms of general use. The only thing we saw is some change in resources. We found 21 stone tools, mostly projectile points and bifaces, again, dating to this primarily to this later time period, but there is a Middle Archaic point there as well. No groundstone at all. Now, remember that when I talk about the next site. So what this clearly was, especially when I went to Fullerton and looked at the faunal remains, is this was a very specialized hunting camp. And I actually took this photo. So you know that they were there hanging around. And out there, there is a bighorn sheep crossing. So we know that bighorn sheep was plentiful in the area. What's interesting is there's no change in use through time, but you do start seeing, not surprisingly, more small game through time. But they still love their bighorn. So that got us interested in saying, well, what about these other dune sites? We knew that some of them were base camps because they had hearths and groundstone and all kinds of different tools. But then we had this other site that was out there that looked a little bit different. It's called the Mojave Delta site. And we went out there to see how that particular site fit in with this whole model of got these base camps. We now have this specialized hunting camp. How does this fit in with everything? So really looking at the use and determine how this all fit in with what we were finding at other sites in the Mojave Sink. I will say for any archaeologists on the call, and Lisa, you sitting here, digging in dunes just sucks in terms of trying to keep your walls straight. These poor students, I'd be like, keep your walls straight. And they're going, we can't. But it's really easy to screen. So we excavated, we found, again, what was surprising to us, a very specialized artifact assemblage. This time, hardly any points, tons of brownstone. And so, some of it heavily used, but most not very heavily used. Some of it turned over, which suggests to us that they were preparing to come back to the site, because that's often what you would do, what mobile groups did in the past, is that they would turn the matates over so they didn't get peed on by animals and things like that. So, and then again, we have ceramics from there. But very different assemblage. We also had a number of really, really ugly looking rock features. And these are fire-cracked rock with some ash. You really got to, I use this all the time in my archaeological methods class to talk about formation processes, because these dunes were just reworking these features. This was literally the most intact feature we found. So just really and we took a flotation sample from that, and Dave Brody looked at it, and he would have found something if there was something there, but we had no data on what they were processing out there. We think that what they were processing out there were spring annuals because of the location of the site and the truly specialized use, almost solely groundstone, ceramics, and those features. And so what all of this began to show us was that the land use in this area was really conditioned by two things. One is resource availability, no surprise there. Water availability, like I said, there are springs right there. But really, this was tied to the gender division of labor. So one of the things that we wanted to figure out was, how did those base camps fit into it? So Tiffany and I looked at this, and what we really found was that we see a real difference depending on the climate. So these folks are responding really flexibly to climatic change. So during dry seasons, periods of drought, they didn't even come into the area to live, okay? They lived in these well-watered areas, mostly probably along the Mojave River, and then, as we'll see later, along Pleistocene lakes. But then what they did is, from these bases and these well-watered areas, they would go into other regions like Soda Playa to gather and hunt. And so you really see these specialized task groups going in there. That contrasts to when it's wetter, during wetter periods. And during wetter periods, they're actually camping in there, probably near the springs. And so you just see this very different kind of use depending on the environment. So really very flexible adaptation. So then we had the opportunity to move down the road to Afton Canyon. And I showed that to you on the map earlier. Why Afton Canyon is important is because it has the Mojave River going through it. So there is a reliable water source. Here's Afton Canyon right now. You can see this beautiful ribbon of green, but you also see these hillsides. And so we did a survey of the hillsides in response to Joan Schneider, who worked with us also out there when we were working out at Soda Springs Wax Shelter with Claude. And she said, hey, Barb, I think there are some features up on those slopes. You guys should go look at those. So we did. They were processing mesquite along the river. And so we found kind of, again, two basic adaptations along the river. You're seeing more intense occupations. But then we found these very distinct features on the hill slopes. And they are hunting blocks. And so one of the things that we were looking at is these don't look like much, but they did take labor. And they took quite a bit of significant amount of labor to get the rocks, to stack the rocks, to keep the rocks stacked. We find them, they've fallen down by this time, but we find them in a sequence, in a linear sequence along these ridges. And so we really tie this to the use of the bow and arrow, the introduction of the bow and arrow. Once the bow and arrow comes in and they're able to efficiently hunt a bighorn using these blinds, then all of a sudden it's worth the labor to build them. And I learned much more about bighorn hunting than I ever knew before. And there are some really creepy websites about bighorn hunting out there. But the thing that what they were doing, what's pretty clear what they were doing is they were probably family groups, again, driving the bighorn, and they will run up. And so as they drive them up, probably using dogs. Ethnographically, they use dogs. We don't know if they use dogs, but we're assuming they might have. And they run the bighorn up, and then the hunter would be sitting in hiding in the rock shelter, in the hunting blind, and then shoot them as they came up. The only artifacts we tend to find in these, it's great because you all get bored when you're just sitting around, right? Are tool repair flakes. Very few artifacts of any kind, but the ones that we usually find are debitage from them sitting there and repairing their tools. We found a few discarded tools too, but not very many. They usually took stuff with them when they left. So in summary of this kind of notion of land use, at Soda Playa, we have camps during the wet season or targeted gender-specific seasonal use during dry seasons. Afton Canyon, again, a continuation of that very specialized use, seasonal procurement, but not possible until the bow and arrow. So we were pretty happy with what we'd figured out in this region. And then we said, well, is that what's going on everywhere in the Mojave Desert? And so we had an opportunity to go out and work at a site in the lovely Pahrump Valley and kind of see if the same models of land use were across a broader area of the Mojave Desert. And so my colleague, Kira, is now going to share our work out there.
All right, hello everyone. If someone can just let me know that you can see this when I pull it up, that would be neat.
It is up and visible.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about our findings from the Stump Springs field school last year in the spring semester that was conducted by Dr. Roth. So we have a wonderful view of all of the students working together, and we caught pretty good weather for the majority of the season, which is about all that you asked for. So Stump Springs is a prehistoric site that has a historic component as well. The historic component is related to the Old Spanish Trail, which cuts through the area. It's actually This is Old Spanish Trail Highway. That's right there. It's not labeled. But we didn't do any work with the historic component. We focused entirely on the prehistoric component. And the site has been recorded multiple times over the past 60 years. So you get these varying site records and different site maps. And at first we were a little frustrated because the maps were very general. And we were like, oh, why are they not more specific? And then when we got out there, we were like, oh, that's why it's not more specific, because the site is an extensive complex of fire-cracked rock that continues to go on. So delineating site boundaries is really difficult with that. And there's a lot of intact thermal features, groundstone, and lithics that are present at the site. So we can see here too, there's the Pahrump Valley, it's about there. And I wanted to make sure that this was a little transparent so you can kind of see the situation in between. These are spring mounds that are through here. So the location that's in between the springs is very important. So it's located on an eroded dune escarpment. Most of the vegetation is of the creosote scrub brush community with some yucca as well. And the local geology is mostly sedimentary and igneous, and the sedimentary component is very important because the majority of the lithics that we're finding are sandstone. So these local spring mounds remained active through the historic component of the site. So basically when people decided to settle the Pahrump Valley, as we do all the time, we pump out all the groundwater and then we make the springs run dry. But this would have been a really important place because the water was predictable and reliable. So it's some place that you could go all the time, which is important because of different climatic variations in the past. So currently our environment, the climate is really hot and really dry. But in the past, I'll just like sum it up as being cool, wet, hot, dry, cool, wet, hot, dry. So you have it yo-yos back and forth consistently. So this would have been an important, predictable place to be. And because of this water, a really important resource was located there, which are these mesquite strands that are in the dunes. So you have this predictable food source that's there with the predictable water, making it an ideal location. So the research focus was on the historic component. The site originally, when we conducted the field school, was roughly 400 by 600 meters. But we have expanded it considerably, especially to the north, to be about 600 by 300 meters. And that's because there's a downslope that goes through there, and it's on an alluvial fan and the eroded dunal escarpment, which makes, like Barb was talking about, formation processes. This is really important because, as you can see in this photo, there's just all of that rock is fire-cracked rock, and it's everywhere. So during his multiple recordings, there have been some really fun things discovered that unfortunately we haven't been able to relocate, such as ceramics. So the ceramics that have been recorded include Moapa grayware, Southern Paiute brownware, and Lower Colorado buffware. So it would be fun to find those, but I feel like other people have found those because they're fun and they took them from the site. So the fire-cracked rock features, there are hundreds of them. So these eroded thermal features, and they're often associated with dense lithic and groundstone scatters as well. So here's just some nice intact features so you can kind of get an idea for what they look like, where you can see just really intense thermal exposure that's on these. So a lot of the rocks have kind of exploded. And some of them, we got some nice soil discoloration. You can kind of see it in this photo that's on. That'll be on your left or right, depending on where you're sitting. But the other photo, you can see much better where that soil has been very thermally affected as well. And some of the local sandstone, like I mentioned, you can see are these brown flakes that are here, and they're pretty easily identifiable. The artifacts that we found included a lot of groundstone, which is on the right and the left. As well as one of the most fun finds, which is a broken atlatl weight, which I found, and that takes the cake for the coolest thing that I found. You know, as an archaeologist, everyone's like, what's the coolest thing you found? And for me, it is that atlatl weight, which is made of schist, which also doesn't show up on the local geology. So we were working with a couple of research questions, which are what are the dates of the occupation of the site? How was it used repeatedly over time? and do the dates relate to these climatic conditions that existed? We were also interested in looking at what the subsistence practices of the groups who used the site were, if they were targeting specific resources, as suggested by the thermal features and abundance of groundstone, and importantly, how the occupation of the Stump Springs site ties into prehistoric land use in this region of the Mojave Desert. So that is in progress, but as you can see with Barb's previous presentation, in this one, it seems to tie into a persistent place model where people are settling the same areas throughout time as the climate is very unstable. So for the field class, we did a site survey. We mapped the site, which was very important. Like I mentioned, those maps were really, really variable, but at least we understood why after we were doing it. And also did 10 by 10 sample analytical units, so that's 10 by 10 meters, and we just did surface recording of those. And they were judgmentally placed in a grid. We ended up with basically 2 SAU zones, one that ran north-south through the central west portion of the site, and another set that was in the eastern portion of the site where the mesquite strands would have been, so we can kind of get an idea for what they were targeting where. And in-field analysis included attribute analysis for formal tools, groundstone and unique artifacts were mapped, and the majority of the tools were photographed as well. And we also estimated the fire-cracked rock, which was really challenging, but because there's a lot of it. Yeah, so that's this is the first unit. I think this is unit A because it's closest to the trucks. And what was neat was a couple of the features that were there would straddle both units. So it was cool as you're doing in-field recording where you normally get kind of a piecemeal idea of the site. Because these features go through both, you get a wider range of what's going on as you're communicating with your teammates. So the lithic sources, we looked at local versus non-local materials. The materials were largely sandstone, CCS, and obsidian, a lot of sandstone. So the formal tools, as we would expect, are made of non-local materials. We know where the closest obsidian sources are, but we don't know where the closest CCS sources are. Fortunately, people are starting to do some research with CCS sourcing, which I'm very thankful for, because that's always the mystery. And the expedient tools and the groundstone were made of all of the local material. So I have a geologic map of the area, and I also laid in some of the drainages that are there, so you can kind of get an idea for how all of this material is eroding into the site. So the yellow color is a carbonate shelf, which includes limestone, dolomite, sandstone, and shale. The blue is just carbonate limestone. The red includes volcanic flows of basalt. And we didn't really, where it's pink with igneous intrusive, we didn't really get any of that there. And the obsidian that we found was sourced via portable XRF, which was really fantastic to have. So the obsidian was sourced by Dr. Lucas Johnson of Far Western, and he got to come out and show everyone how they do it and show everyone the portable XRF machine, which is always really cool. So 4 samples were sourced to Shoshone Mountain, and 1 was sourced to the South Pahrump Range. So Shoshone Mountain is the closest, but is still pretty far away, and the South Pahrump Range is very, very far away. And curiously, none were sourced from the Devil Peak source, which is actually the closest, as it's in the Clark Mountains. And that's a really common and close source, but the catch with the Devil Peak sources is that it erodes out in very small obsidian nodules that are about this big. So if you are there using an atlatl, that's not a very desirable tool stone because you have to be able to use small amounts of it. The obsidian also came from small flakes and no tools, and the flakes were less than 2 centimeters in size. So the obsidian was 1, very rare, and 2, very, very small. The groundstone was almost exclusively sandstone, which isn't a surprise as that material is the most abundant. There are some exceptions, mostly with quartzite for handstones. We had, for the field season, we had 3 unidentified pieces of groundstone, 25 handstones, 1 matadi fragment, and 7 pestles, which was a very cool find. So this picture is feature 16, which is a groundstone cluster and a thermal feature. Because everything is fire crazed, it's a little hard to tell what is what. But there were approximately 100 pieces of fire-cracked rock with the local sandstone flakes, so you can kind of get an idea of the volume that we're working with. So our preliminary results for what is going on at the site is that it would have been used for plant processing. This is likely for all of the mesquite that's there, because mesquite is a desirable resource and it's very tasty. So that's always great. And also the severe fire-cracked rock breakage indicates a really high heat fire, and mesquite burns at a high heat temperature. So if anyone wants some fun experimental archaeology to do, that would be a really fun project. So we, in the previous site recordings, they mentioned burned faunal bone, but we didn't relocate any faunal remains during the field season. So that could have either eroded away or it could have been misidentified. So the large amounts of groundstone largely support this interpretation of focusing on vegetal processing at the site. And of all of the features that we recorded during the field season, we did 17 features and 16 of them are thermal features. So that is largely just what they're doing there. And the plant resource exploitation remains constant between the archaic and late prehistoric components of the site. So I'll show you a quick little map of the boundary that we delineated there. So this indicates that that the Pahrump Valley and Stump Springs in particular would have been a persistent place for past groups to go to over time. So this is a rough map from last year, where you have the archaic component, which is here and around. The late prehistoric component hugs the mesquite strands a lot tighter, which is on the eastern portion of the site. And then there's a processing component that was at the north end of the site. So you'll see that this looks a little amorphous and small. And we have done subsequent field visits, which have considerably expanded the site. So just for reference, if you look at this little mesquite strand, that's all the way up there. Right here is where it is in this photo. So we found a lot more stuff on our subsequent field visits. And I know that this map is a little busy. So this is just something that I put together to get an idea. So here are the archaic component SAUs that we identified that are down here. This is where the mesquite strands are. And if you notice, all of these crosses are features, and there's a ton of features that are out here. Another thing that we noticed was these little eroding, these triangles are lithic sources, and that's actually a limestone flow. So during subsequent field visits, I noticed these little limestone outcrops popping up, and I thought that maybe they were like limestone caches or something for cooking. And I found that I did a quick little survey through here and identified that on GIS as well, where I took some points. But this is actually an entire flow, and that goes down here and in through here. So there's exposed limestone shelves that are there, which is also, if you're adding more things to be the perfect place to live, you have water, you have food, and you also have plenty of resources to make your features for processing your food, which is great. There's also a lot of loci that are there. So that is these little color-coded polygons. So yellow is the largest and purple is the smallest. So you can see that the north end of the site has some loci that are really large. So the current interpretations that we have for the site is that it's a high mobility logistical processing site, which is evidenced by the thermal features and the groundstone, as well as mesquite. So a nice quote that I read by Claude Warren states, where sand dunes, mesquite, and water occur or occurred together in valley bottoms, there's a high potential for dense site concentrations, which we are starting to see evidence of as well, because one of the students during the field season found another site to the south. So the entire area of Stump Springs has multiple spring mounds. And my assumption is that all of these spring mounds are going to have sites that largely have the same constituents. So this would have been a persistent place. So site use stays constant. However, it does intensify during the late prehistoric. So during the archaic versus the late prehistoric component, there's a little bit of temporal change in distribution and targeting with late prehistoric intensification. So it looks like they were really going after the mesquite very heavily at that point. So right now we're kind of looking at the fit into the region, kind of looking at how persistent use, mobility, and springs signal important locations to people in the area. We're also chasing down a couple other strands because Stump Springs has been mentioned in a couple of pilgrimage papers that have been done on pilgrimages up to New Vagantu, which is Mount Charleston, which is the birthplace of the Nuuvi Southern Paiute people. So there's a lot of ethnographic work that's going to go into here. So that's part of the future work, is looking at ethnographic data, because this would have been an important location to the Southern Paiute and Chemehuevi. We also have a lot of indigenous trails that run through this region. So in the Ivanpah Valley, there's actually 2 trails that bisect in the middle, which is the Salt Song Trail and the Mountain Sheep Trail. And the Salt Song Trail in particular also goes up the Pahrump Valley into Pahrump, where the Southern Paiute settlement of Pahrump would have been. We also are interested in doing some sampling to see exactly what these thermal features are completely composed of. Some of them are very intact, so we have a pretty strong probability of getting some results out of that. So that includes flotation samples, doing soil samples, coring, which would be great for climactic reconstruction, starch grain analysis, radiocarbon dates, and hopefully a little bit of excavation, as this field season was entirely based on pedestrian survey. So again, we're tying this into regional site trends, which include persistent places, also roasting complexes, which ties into what I'm going to talk about next, and also spring sites. So moving forward again, we're going to valley hop a little bit more. So this is the Ivanpah Valley. Prim is right here, and those terribly ugly solar towers that blind you if you look at them are located right there, just to kind of situate you. So this view is like is kind of southeast. So my master's thesis site is Ivanpah Dry Lake. And Ivanpah Dry Lake would have been a persistent place as well, because it was occupied from the terminal Pleistocene, early Holocene, where we have like a sparse artifact assemblage, but there's some paleo points that are there, and then in through contact. And it would have been occupied by a residentially mobile population, and is a logistical resource zone as well. This also has a thermal feature complex. Admittedly, the thermal features don't look nearly as fire-cracked and crazed as those out at Stump Springs, but the entire lake bed is covered with these thermal features. And one ground recon trip that we did, we reported, I think it was 55 thermal features in about a 5 or 6 hour field day, if that gives you an idea for the intensity that's here. Again, they're using these local materials for feature construction, and then non-local materials for formal tools as well. And this is important because there would have been a lot of heavy trade here and mixed group interactions, because it goes along the Salt Song Trail and the Fox Song Trail. So you have a lot of cultural overlap that happens. There's also some really fun features as well that involve some brine shrimp or tadpole shrimp. So if you want to learn more about those, you're going to have to listen to me a little bit later. But this area is probably eligible as a cultural landscape, traditional cultural property, or district, but I think that it has a very strong case for being National Register eligible as a cultural landscape. So both the Ivanpah Valley and the Pahrump Valley are mentioned very heavily in Southern Paiute and Chemehuevi ethnographies, and they're both places that are of great importance to them as well. So if you see here, this is Barb walking with Doug Sims. Doug Sims was very, very kind and took us out there and showed us a bunch of stuff that is not recorded, which is important for tadpole shrimp. And all of these rocks, these don't occur naturally on the lake bed. They are brought there. And you can see a thermal feature here, 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 and then they continue all the way out. So that's looking roughly north. So this would have been an important place as well. And if you have questions about Ivanpah, you're going to have to come to my thesis defense for more information about that. And for acknowledgements, we just want to say thank you to the Spring 2022 field crew. It was a lot of fun. And it was fun to see people kind of get lost in these brush hummocks that are behind, and just get to hang out with everyone and talk about archaeology and experience the outdoors, which we got snowed on one day. That was in, I think it was March. So that was interesting. We also want to thank the BLM for letting us do our field school out there. Dr. Lucas Johnson in Far Western for the XRF, UNLV for letting us go out and have a field school and teach the next generation of archaeologists. And almost most importantly, the Black Christmas tree, because that was the easiest identifier to make sure that you took the right trail off-road.
Right at the Christmas tree.
All right, let me stop sharing so we can see folks and maybe there's some questions. I know we've actually got some time today. That's good. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see us again?
Sure can.
Yes, you were visible.
Thank you. So if anybody out there virtually has questions, we're a small enough group, you can unmute yourself and maybe ask Dr. Roth or Kara directly, or you can put it in the chat thread and I'll moderate it for you. But to get us started, I have a question as somebody that doesn't actually work in the desert. So I know the mesquite is fuel and the wood is valued.
Oh, the pods.
You're talking, there's pods. There's
and there's
pods.
Okay. The neat thing about the pods is that they have, they can hear me, right?
Yes, everybody can hear.
They have both seeds, which are high in protein,
Okay.
and then the pod itself is sweet. And so it's kind of a great resource and really nutritious.
So, okay, so that's probably what they're grinding on. All
Yeah,
these grinding stones,
the
they're
seeds for the
grinding it
for
down.
flour, because
Oh,
they make mesquite flour.
okay, cool. I didn't know that.
I've also heard of, because you can take the powder and you can add it to water and it's full of electrolytes. So it's like a prehistoric Gatorade essentially. And it's also very tasty because it has just like that slightly sweet flavor and it's a little nutty. So, and there's Scroobian mesquite, and then there's just the, regular mesquite that comes in the regular bean pods, but yeah.
Yeah, so it was the pods that they were.
Okay, all right, now I know. Also, you're gonna have to tell me what Mojave Max is, because that also.
Oh,
I'm not a desert.
Mojave Max is a desert tortoise. He used to live out at Red Rock. He now lives at the Springs Preserve. But you didn't go to elementary school here, because all the elementary schools, they have contests to see when they can predict when he will come out
So
of
he's
his
the
burrow.
gopher, he's gonna come out.
Pusatoni Phil.
Is he the Pusatoni
Yeah,
Phil?
he is. But he hasn't come out, and today, April 17th was, to this point, the record for being that late. It's the
Okay.
latest he had ever come out, and he's not out yet. Now, his burrow mate is already out.
All right, she couldn't be sequestered with him anymore. All right, Dan has a question. So go ahead, Dan, if you want to unmute yourself, I'll let you take it away. Or chat.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And thanks, Barb and Kara, for a really interesting talk. Barb, I have a question from your portion of the talk when you were talking about, the riverine camp areas or settlement areas, and then those specialized areas away from the river. And you said it was largely that their use was largely dictated by changes in climate or drought conditions. So my question is, if I understood that correctly, so what was under what circumstances, or what was the resource that would become available or critical in those dry periods when they would move away from the water source to these specialized areas to get I presume a new food resource or process it? What is it about that changing climatic conditions that made movement away from the riverine source, which is where you would think
That's
they would
great.
stay?
Yeah, that's a great question. And they did stay. What we're seeing are basically two patterns. So when it's wetter in general, we actually see them camping and living along Soda Playa. So it's only when it gets so dry that they can't do that they stay at the riverine water sources.
Right.
But they're always exploiting those other resources, which is the hunting the bighorn, and what we're assuming is the spring annuals. And so they're always exploiting them. It's just that when it's super dry, they go in with these specialized task force. When it's wet, they actually move in there and camp and stay there.
I see.
It's just a change in kind of how they're doing it. So instead of living there, they're doing it specifically.
So that would be because it was just, the conditions would just make it.
Too
much
dry
more
to live
difficult
there,
for
yeah.
the camp there, yeah, I see. Okay.
For more than a few days. I mean, because it was probably based on, now Soda Springs Rock Shelter is near a spring, so they would, but we think that when it got really dry, it also got dry. So really, I think was conditioned by how much water they could take with them.
Right, makes sense. Thank you. Nice presentation.
All right, so we do have a question from Kat. Were any other hunting methods indicated besides projectile pointed weapons? Is there ever any evidence of trapping or snares or any for bighorns or other game, or is the desert too dry for that kind of evidence to remain?
We're almost, based on ethnography, we're almost certain that they were using both traps and snares, especially for the small, I mean, for the desert tortoise, they're probably
And little hairs and stuff, right?
But yeah, and going into their burrows and things like that. But believe it or not, I have seen a trap. I was on a site steward trip one time, and they actually it was in a rock. I'm not going to tell you where it is. It was in a rock shelter, and it was completely preserved, but it was just that really rare moment of preservation. So Kat, we think that they were using them a lot, but yeah, they just didn't preserve.
Yeah, preservation is an issue. So I'm going to also
that question, Barbara. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So the gender specific tasks, I assume, was the grinding part. Is that?
And the hunting. So we think that the males were hunting, and again, based on ethnographic analogy.
Okay, any other questions from anybody? Okay, so I guess we're just gonna have to look forward to Kara's defense to
Yeah.
find out about the
About Ivan.
the shrimp and tadpoles. Shrimp. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for signing in, and thank you to Barb and to Kara for sharing. We read about this, many of you may have seen this, featured in the UNLV newsletter, so they've already gotten props for doing this field school, so now you get to see what they've been up to, so thank you for presenting. Have a good rest of your Monday, everyone, and we'll see you next week. I don't have that title, but look out for next week's agenda.